Well, you are a professor in Princeton's religion department,
Hmm.
and you've written a couple of books, one of which we're going to talk about. It's this one, Paving the Great Way, published by Columbia University Press. The subtitle is Vasubandhu's Unifying Buddhist Philosophy. Now, a lot of people probably haven't heard of Vasubandhu, but the fact is that he looms as large in Buddhism's intellectual history as anyone other than the Buddha himself. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I really think it is. Anybody who is familiar with Buddhist thought has encountered Vasubandhu at one time or another, probably many times.
Yeah.
I see him as really one of the main exponents of sort of mainstream Buddhist philosophy, even though he kind of gets represented as somebody who takes a couple of different particular traditions as his own, switching from one to the other. What I'm trying to show in the book is that he's really a mainstream Buddhist.
Okay.
Anyway, thanks for having me, by the way.
I'm really looking forward to it because I was so impressed by the book. I mean, it's sometimes you read a book, and although you may not be quite fit to judge, you're pretty sure that it demonstrates mastery of the subject, and in this case, I definitely got that sense.
I appreciate that.
And this is so interesting to me because I think there are a lot of misconceptions about Buddhism, I think, floating around out there. And I think this book makes a couple of things clear. First of all, there is, aside from Buddhism, the religion, there is a very rich Buddhist philosophy that sometimes gets intertwined with religious concepts such as reincarnation, but at the same time, much of it can be analyzed independent of that, and indeed has a lot in common with Western philosophy. And I think this is a good example of that. So this is like he lived in the 4th or 5th century. We're not sure, but that's close to a millennium, maybe a little less than after the Buddha lived.
Right.
And I would think that the sophistication of the philosophy compares pretty well with anything that was going on in the West at that time. And I would also say it's more Western in a certain sense than people realize. And I want to emphasize that it is more almost scientific in the sense of very much grounded in what you might call a scientific worldview. And in fact, I would say, although people think of Buddhism as this kind of weird, ethereal, woo-woo stuff, there actually is rigorous argumentation from Vasubandhu and others that I think, tell me if I'm wrong, that I think is kind of saying the implications of a scientific worldview may be weirder than you think. Is that fair to say?
That's definitely fair as an assessment of my view of Vasubandhu. I even say some of this in the book. I make an argument that Vasubandhu's view gives us a way of thinking about the scientific worldview as you're saying, sort of weirder than we would normally think of it. It's not a common sense view, but neither Buddhist philosophy doesn't tell us that things are just the way that they seem, but then neither does modern science. And as to the question of that you pointed out, that Buddhism seems often very much like a sophisticated philosophy rather than like a religion. Certainly, Vasubandhu is trying to write in a way that's going to appeal to people who don't necessarily share his Buddhist background and assumptions. So some of his writing in India in the middle of the first millennium, he's taking on other philosophers outside of the Buddhist tradition, so traditions that are sort of orthodox traditions that are sort of in the line of what we end up calling Hinduism. So he's arguing on a kind of playing field that he shares with non-Buddhists and even people who don't agree with any particular religious view. So I think that that's something that you can sense reading this argumentation. He's really appealing to a wide audience, or at least trying to reason in a way that might bring more people to understand his view who don't share his assumptions.
Okay. So here are some topics that his work touches on. I don't know how many of these we'll have time to get to, but just to give people a sense of the range. The idea of free will, given a fundamentally, in some ways, scientific worldview, is there room for free will and moral responsibility? The question of time, is time, in modern physics, there are people, I think it's almost a mainstream view that the present and the future both in some sense exist right now. He addressed a version of that question.
He critiques that view at some length.
Yeah, and but the one I want to start with, because and you alluded to it a little, and I alluded to it when I said the implications of a scientific worldview may be weirder than you think. I want to start with this question of like whether the reality we perceive is really real, is really out there, and maybe we should back up a little further than that and provide just a little bit of a detail on where he fits into Buddhism kind of taxonomically. So he's associated with the Yogacara school.
Yeah, Yogacara.
Yogacara, okay. He's one of the primary developers of that school of thought, I'd say. And that school is associated with something called, I think, mind only, which isn't to say he holds that view. We'll get into his view. But the mind only view is that reality's not real like at all, kind of. So it might be something like what the Western philosopher Berkeley, I mean, here I'm getting totally out of my depth, but a name people will have heard of maybe is that Berkeley's idea called idealism that, the world out there isn't real in nearly the sense that you think it is. So anyway, so he kind of enters the Yogacara lineage and he grapples with that question, which we'll get to. Biographically, he is said to have been the half-brother of the person who's commonly said to have been the founder, I think, of the Yogacara school, and who is also said to have spent years meditating in a cave or something. I don't know. I don't know how much of that we trust, but...
Right. Well, Asanga is said to be his half-brother, and the narrative goes that actually Vasubandhu started as a non-Mahayana, non-Great Vehicle scholar, and he was trained in the Kashmiri Vaibhashika school, which is one of the schools, probably the main, the most prestigious school of his day.
So let me just stop and say Yogacara is part of Mahayana. Mahayana is distinguished mainly from Theravada, the other main school of Buddhism. Today, right. Not necessarily in those days, but okay.
Right. So in those days, there were other schools in addition to the Theravada, and one of them would have been the Vaibhashika. So that's the one where he was educated.
Okay.
So all of the non-Mahayana schools would have shared some things about them. It's not even clear that Mahayana was ever really a separate group of people that would have shared, for instance, a monastery or anything like that. But it might have been a movement, like a philosophical movement, or even a practice movement within the traditions.
And just by way of getting in another book plug, so the term Great Way in the title, Paving the Great Way, that's kind of what Mahayana means?
Right. So I'm kind of making the argument that Vasubandhu is making the Mahayana seem mainstream in his analysis of Vaibhashika, in his early analysis of those traditions and his arguments advocating for a view that he calls Sautrantika. He's sort of smoothing the way toward a broader acceptance of Mahayana views, of Great Vehicle views.
Okay.